Home prices rising in June for a third straight month, but prices are expected to fall through the rest of the year with the expiration of the tax cuts. The Standard & Poor's Case-Shiller 20-city home price index posting a 1% increase month after month, over month. 17 cities showed monthly price gains. For the full quarter, April to June, home prices nationally were up 4%. 4.4%.
So is bringing back the homebuyer tax credit the answer? Will it fix the slumping housing market? Opposing views from David Berenbaum, Chief Program Officer at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and mortgage industry consultant Howard Glazer, who is former counselor to HUD Secretary Andrew Cuomo. David, let's start with you. You are in favor of bringing back the homebuyer tax credit. Why?
The National Community Reinvestment Coalition feels that the tax credit, as a component of a focused national policy, will help working families to realize home ownership. But it needs to be coupled with efforts to keep homeowners who are facing foreclosure, more than 8 million families, in their housing. So we need a broader policy that's dealing with issues of unemployment and sustaining home ownership, coupled with incentives to really stabilize the housing market as a whole.
Howard, what do you think? Do you think that bringing back the tax credit could be part of a bigger strategy?
Well, the problem with the tax credit is that it's an artificial stimulant, and when it goes away, the hangover is pretty big. We saw that home sales declined 25% for existing homes in July when the credit expired, and new home sales declined to their lowest point since they started keeping records in 1963. That's not a viable policy. It doesn't bring stability. It brings volatility. Where I agree with David is that the underlying problems have yet to be addressed. Jobs, number one. Number two, an insanely tight credit policy, as Joe Nocera put it in his column in the New York Times last week, for mortgages. And thirdly, the fear that borrowers have that if home prices continue to decline, they don't want to get in the market now.
But David,
tax credit doesn't address those things.
Exactly. The tax credit does not really address the unemployment situation, David. And there are those who say that if you add the tax credit back in, you may get people who are on the verge of losing their jobs getting into a home because of the tax credit when the underlying state of the economy is simply too weak.
Well, that's a very good point. But also, we can amend the tax credit. For example, unfortunately, there are some families that do need to sell their home due to a short sale. They can't sustain that housing. Imagine if a speculator would have an incentive through the tax credit to, in fact, rent to that family so they're not displaced, they're not homeless. We need to be looking out of the box for creative techniques that sustain our communities. If we don't do that, not only are the homeowners and communities injured, but the entire tax base. And I agree with Howard. We need to see Fannie and Freddie doing what FHA has been doing, which is liberalizing underwriting for safe and sound, responsible loans that consumers can afford, coupled with the tax credit.
Now, Howard, some people would say that home inventories are getting dangerously high right now. What do you make of David's suggestion that this is a necessary piece of a bigger strategy?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Inventories are bloated, but that's only half the equation. Even if inventories come down by taking homes off the market through foreclosure relief or other methods, you still have the problem of demand. Demand is extraordinarily soft on the housing side, and even when there is demand, the borrowers can't get credit. Think about this. The federal government controls two of the largest financial institutions in the country, if not the world, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and at the same time they're exhorting private banks to do more lending. They are cutting back on lending through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac with exorbitant credit standards. So the federal government needs to take its own medicine, loosen credit standards at Fannie and Freddie to reasonable standards. Not talking about making the garbage loans that we saw the last 5 years. Prudent credit standards. There are a lot of qualified borrowers out there right now that would like to get into a home and can't do it because of the tight credit policy.
David,
that would assist demand.
It sounds to me like you are both starting from square one, and forgive me for trying to blow up square one, but David, why should the government be involved in promoting home ownership at all? What's the big deal about owning a home?
Well, frankly, home ownership as a long-term investment is a way of creating intergenerational wealth for our children, and it's a way out of poverty.
Hasn't worked that way lately.
Well, when you look at all the non-traditional loans originated to America's middle class and also the subprime predatory loans, for sure. but we need tighter regulation. We're going to be getting that with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Now we need the banks that benefited from the public bailout to start lending again, not only to consumers, but to small businesses as well.
But David,
and frankly,
to Mark's point, though, if you have an intervention in a market, and you could be talking about almost any market, we just happen to be talking about housing, and you intervene in that market and put through a tax credit, perhaps a homebuyer tax credit, a floor or a false component to that market, a lot of people argue that the market will never equalize. It will never find its true bottom, and therefore you have to keep intervening in that market.
Well, I think that's a fair point, and we need to, as was noted, to actually get government out of originating over 90% of the loans. That's what's happening now.